At 0600 hours on July 8th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Harry Mathis stood ankle-deep in mud on Espiritu Santo, a jungle-covered island in the New Hebrides 200 miles south of Guadalcanal. Steam rose from the tree line as the tropical sun burned through morning mist. The air smelled of rotting vegetation and salt water. Through gaps in the coconut palms, he could see the channel where his transport ship had anchored 2 hours earlier. Behind him, 390 men from the 3rd Construction Battalion Detachment were unloading equipment onto a beach that wasn't really a beach, just a narrow strip of coral and black volcanic sand that disappeared into swamp grass after 30 feet. They had 6 tractors, 2 scrapers, 1 grease truck, 1 petrol wagon, 3 weapons carriers, and a generator. That was the entire inventory of heavy equipment for the job they'd been sent to do. The job was simple, impossible, but simple. Build a 6,000-foot runway through virgin jungle in 20 days. Not 21 days, not 3 weeks, 20 days. Because in 20 days, American bombers needed to be taking off from this exact spot to attack the Japanese airfield under construction on Guadalcanal. And if those bombers didn't fly, if that Japanese airfield became operational first, then Australia's supply lines would be cut, the Solomon Islands would fall, and the entire Pacific strategy would collapse. Mathis looked at the wall of jungle in front of him. Trees 100 feet tall, vines thick as a man's arm, ground so waterlogged that boots sank 6 inches with every step. He later remembered thinking just one thing. There wasn't a damn thing there but jungle. To understand why 20 days mattered so desperately, you have to understand what was happening across the Pacific in the summer of 1942. 6 months earlier, Pearl Harbor had been attacked. 4 months earlier, the Philippines had fallen. 2 months earlier, the Coral Sea had been fought to a draw. 1 month earlier, Midway had turned the tide, but only barely. The United States was still reeling, still scrambling, still trying to figure out how to fight a war across an ocean so vast that distance itself became a weapon. The Japanese understood geography. They had spent decades studying how to turn the Pacific's immensity into an advantage. Their strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Seize islands, build airfields, use those airfields to control the seas around them, create an expanding perimeter of air power that would make any American counterattack prohibitively expensive. By mid-1942, they were winning. On Guadalcanal, Japanese construction units had arrived in early July. They brought 1,379 men in one unit and 1,145 in another. These weren't combat troops. They were engineers, laborers, surveyors. Their mission was to carve an airfield out of the jungle at a place called Lunga Point. If they succeeded, Japanese bombers would control the Coral Sea. They would threaten American supply convoys to Australia. They would make it nearly impossible for American forces to advance north through the Solomon Islands. The Japanese worked methodically. They surveyed the ground. They planned drainage. They marked trees. They moved earth. Construction doctrine, handed down from decades of military engineering tradition. By the night of August 6th, they were nearly finished. The commander gave his men an extra sake ration to celebrate completing the airfield ahead of schedule. The Americans knew this because coast watchers, Australian scouts hidden in the jungle, had been reporting construction progress for weeks. Every day, the reports grew more urgent. The runway is taking shape. The runway is almost complete. The runway will be operational within days. American commanders looked at maps and did calculations that kept them awake at night. The nearest American airfield was on Efate. 300 miles south, bombers could reach Guadalcanal from Efate. Barely, but fighters couldn't. Without fighter cover, bombers were vulnerable. Without sustained air attacks, the Japanese would finish their runway, and without a closer airbase, there was no way to stop them, which is why Lieutenant Commander Mathis and 390 men were standing in the mud on Espiritu Santo at dawn on July 8th, 1942. Espiritu Santo was halfway between Ifate and Guadalcanal, close enough for fighters to escort bombers, close enough for sustained operations, close enough to matter. But only if there was an airfield. And there wasn't. There was jungle. The men who would build that airfield were not typical soldiers. The United States Navy had created them out of desperation just 6 months earlier. After Pearl Harbor, Navy planners realized they had a problem. The war would require building bases, airfields, ports, fuel depots, hospitals, all across the Pacific, building them in war zones, building them under fire, building them faster than the enemy could destroy them. Civilian contractors couldn't do it. Under international law, civilians captured in combat zones could be executed as spies. The Navy had learned that lesson the hard way. On Wake Island, civilian construction workers had been captured by Japanese forces 15 days after Pearl Harbor. Some were executed. Others were taken as prisoners of war, which they shouldn't have been. Because they weren't soldiers, they were contractors who had picked up rifles when the island was attacked. The solution came from Rear Admiral Ben Moriel: create military construction units, recruit men with construction experience, train them to fight, give them authority to build anything, anywhere, under any conditions. On January 5, 1942, Moriel received authorization to form the 1st Naval Construction Regiment, 3 battalions, construction battalions. Seabee. The men called themselves Seabees. The recruiting standards were unusual. Age range, 18 to 50. Most recruits were in their 30s and 40s, men with families, men with jobs, skilled tradesmen who knew how to operate equipment, pour concrete, wire buildings, fix engines. The first 60 battalions averaged 37 years old. Some men past 60 managed to enlist by lying about their age. They came from every construction trade: carpenters, electricians, plumbers, heavy equipment operators, surveyors, mechanics, welders, men who built bridges in Pennsylvania, dams in California, highways in Texas. They were given advanced rank based on experience, making them the highest paid group in the United States military. A skilled bulldozer operator might enlist as a petty officer 2nd class, earning more than infantry sergeants who'd been in the service for years. The Marines trained them in combat: rifles, machine guns, grenades, close-quarters fighting. The philosophy was simple: build first, fight when necessary, but always finish the job. The motto they adopted came straight from their mission: construimus, batuimus. We build, we fight. And in the summer of 1942, they were about to prove they could do both faster than anyone thought possible. The men unloading equipment on Espiritu Santo represented a fraction of the 3rd Construction Battalion. They'd been pulled from the main unit on Ifate and sent north with orders that offered no room for interpretation. Build a bomber strip. Make it 6,000 feet long. Make it operational in 20 days. American forces would invade Guadalcanal on August 7th. When that invasion happened, bombers needed to be flying from Espiritu Santo to support it. 20 days. That timeline wasn't arbitrary. It was calculated based on Japanese construction progress on Guadalcanal, American invasion planning, and the absolute minimum time required to clear jungle, level ground, and lay down a surface that could handle the weight of fully loaded B-17 bombers. 20 days meant there was no margin for error, no buffer for bad weather, no contingency for equipment failure. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. The first problem was obvious: trees. Espiritu Santo sat in the middle of the New Hebrides archipelago, a chain of tropical islands covered in dense rainforest. The trees were massive. Some reached 150 feet tall, trunks 6 to 8 feet in diameter, root systems that spread underground like nets, and between the trees, vines, ferns, undergrowth so thick you couldn't see 5 feet in any direction. The men had chainsaws, axes, and tractors. That was it. No explosive charges for mass clearing, No specialized logging equipment, just hand tools and determination. They started cutting on the morning of July 8th. Two-man teams on the chainsaws, others following behind with axes to trim branches, tractor operators dragging felled trees to the edge of the clearing where they'd be burned. Later, when time permitted, the heat was suffocating. By 8 in the morning, temperatures exceeded 90 degrees, with humidity approaching 100%. Men worked shirtless, soaked in sweat, breathing air that felt like inhaling steam. Salt tablets were distributed every hour. Water was rationed carefully. Dehydration could kill faster than enemy action. They worked in shifts around the clock. Floodlights, powered by generators, turned night into an approximation of day. The jungle became a factory floor that never closed. Chainsaws screamed, tractors roared, trees crashed down with sounds like thunder. Smoke from burn piles drifted through the worksite in thick columns that made eyes water and throats roar. The second problem appeared as soon as the trees came down. Ground, or more accurately, the lack of it. The jungle floor wasn't solid. It was a mixture of topsoil, decomposing vegetation, and mud that went down several feet before hitting anything resembling stable earth. When tractors tried to drive across it, they sank. When scrapers tried to grade it, they churned it into slurry. The solution was coral. The island was surrounded by coral reefs, dead coral that had built up over millennia into vast deposits of calcium carbonate. Hard, stable, perfect for construction if you could extract it and transport it. The Seabees had explosive charges for blasting coral from the reef flats. They set charges at low tide, waited for detonation, then sent crews with shovels and wheelbarrows to collect the fragments. Other crews loaded the coral onto trucks that hauled it inland to dump sites along the runway path. The coral was crushed, spread and compacted, layer by layer, 6 inches at a time. The tractors rolled over it repeatedly, packing it down until it wouldn't shift under weight. It was slow work, backbreaking work, but it was the only way to create a surface that wouldn't collapse when a 20-ton bomber rolled across it. The third problem was drainage. Tropical rain. Espiritu Santo received over 100 inches of rainfall per year. During the monsoon season, it could rain for days without stopping. Water turned the runway path into a river. Water flooded the coral base. Water undermined everything the Seabees built during the day. They dug drainage ditches parallel to the runway, deep trenches that channeled water away from the construction site toward natural low points where it could collect without causing damage. They built culverts under the runway using corrugated metal pipe. They graded the coral surface with a slight crown so water would run off to the sides instead of pooling in the center. Engineering on the fly. No formal plans, no blueprints, just men with experience solving problems as they encountered them. A carpenter, who'd built bridges in Oregon, figured out the culvert spacing. A plumber from Chicago designed the drainage system. A heavy equipment operator from California calculated load-bearing requirements. Expertise distributed across 390 men working toward a single deadline. The fourth problem was support. The Seabees weren't alone on Espiritu Santo. A company from the 24th Infantry Regiment had come with them to provide security. An anti-aircraft battery from the 4th Marine Defense Battalion had set up positions around the perimeter to shoot down Japanese reconnaissance planes if they appeared. 90 Marines, 295 infantry, 50 Ni Vanuatu locals who'd been hired as laborers. Everyone worked. The infantry helped clear trees. The Marines hauled coral. The locals guided crews to water sources and showed them which plants were safe to eat. In combat zones, job descriptions disappeared. There were tasks that needed completion and people available to complete them. That was the only division that mattered. Food was monotonous: canned rations, spam, corned beef, hardtack, occasionally fresh fruit if the locals brought it. The men ate standing up, took 10 minutes, went back to work. There was no mess hall, no tables, no schedule, just food whenever hunger made working impossible, and then back to the job. Sleep happened in shifts, 4 hours if you were lucky. 2 hours if equipment broke down and you were a mechanic. Some men worked 36-hour stretches because they were operating the only functional bulldozer, and stopping would mean the entire operation stopped. Exhaustion became normal. The baseline state: you worked until your body shut down, slept until noise woke you up, worked again. Disease was a constant threat. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes bred in standing water. Dysentery spread through contaminated food or water. Fungal infections grew on skin that stayed perpetually damp. Coral cuts became infected if not treated immediately. Men reported sick only if they couldn't stand. If you could walk, you worked. The Japanese knew something was happening on Espiritu Santo. Reconnaissance flights spotted construction activity in mid-July, but they were too focused on their own airfield to mount a serious response. A few bombing raids, some strafing runs. The anti-aircraft battery shot down 2 planes and damaged 3 others. The attacks caused delays but didn't stop the work. By July 20th, the tree line had been pushed back far enough to define the runway footprint. 6,000 feet long, 200 feet wide, roughly 25 acres of cleared ground. The coral base was half complete. Drainage ditches were dug. The Seabees were on schedule, but barely. Any major setback would push completion past the deadline. On July 23rd, a tropical storm hit. Not a typhoon, not a hurricane, but sustained winds and rain that lasted 18 hours. Work stopped. The men huddled under tarps and watched water pool in. The drainage ditches, the coral base held. The culverts functioned. The drainage system they'd improvised worked well enough to prevent catastrophic flooding. When the storm passed, they went back to work, with mud up to their knees. On July 27th, the runway was graded and compacted. Not finished, not perfect, but operational. A test vehicle, a truck loaded with sandbags to simulate aircraft weight, drove the length of the runway without sinking. The surface held. Lieutenant Commander Mathis sent a radio message to headquarters. Runway ready for light aircraft. Bombers can land if necessary. On July 28th, the first fighter squadron landed. Grumman F-4F Wildcats, 6 planes. They touched down on a runway that had been virgin jungle 20 days earlier. The pilots climbed out, looked around at the mud, the smoke from burn piles, the exhausted men standing by with shovels and rifles, and asked where the hell they were. Espiritu Santo, someone told them. Middle of nowhere. The only airfield within fighter range of Guadalcanal. On July 29th, Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses arrived. 4 heavy bombers. They landed carefully, testing the runway with each touchdown. The coral base held. The runway didn't crack. The bombers were refueled, loaded with bombs from supply dumps the Seabees had also built, and took off before dawn on July 30th, heading north toward Guadalcanal. The Japanese construction units working on Guadalcanal heard the engines first. Then they saw the bombers. High altitude, too high for their anti-aircraft guns to reach effectively. The bombs fell on the nearly completed airfield at Lunga Point. Craters in the runway, damaged equipment, dead workers. The construction slowed. The Americans kept coming. Every day, bombers from Espiritu Santo hitting Guadalcanal, forcing the Japanese to repair damage instead of completing construction, buying time for the invasion force assembling to the south. The race that Admiral Halsey had described, the race between American and Japanese airfield construction, was over. The Seabees had won. The victory wasn't celebrated. There was too much work left to do. The runway on Espiritu Santo was operational but primitive. It needed to be expanded, reinforced, made permanent. A second fighter strip needed to be built, and then bomber fields, then fuel storage, then housing, then hospitals. The base that would eventually become the second largest American installation in the Pacific Theater was just beginning. But the first 20 days proved something that would echo through the rest of the war. The Seabees could build faster than the enemy, could work in conditions that seemed impossible. could turn jungle into airfields while the enemy was still planning surveys. Speed wasn't just an advantage. Speed was the weapon itself. The contrast with Japanese construction methods was stark and illuminating. When Japanese engineers arrived at a construction site, they brought tradition, detailed surveys, careful planning, manual labor organized along lines that hadn't changed significantly since the Meiji era. Thousands of workers with hand tools, patient excavation, methodical progress. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese construction units had advantages the Seabees never enjoyed. More men, more time, better initial site conditions. Lunga Point was relatively flat, with less dense jungle than Espiritu Santo, yet it took them weeks longer to achieve what the Seabees accomplished in 20 days. The difference wasn't courage or determination. Japanese workers labored just as hard under worse conditions with less food and no medical care. The difference was philosophy. Japanese military doctrine treated construction as a support function, something done behind the lines by non-combat units using methods that prioritized thoroughness over speed. The belief was that well-built infrastructure lasted longer and required less maintenance. That belief made sense in peacetime. In war, it was fatal. While Japanese engineers surveyed and planned, American bulldozers were already moving earth. While Japanese workers dug drainage ditches with shovels, Seabees were blasting coral with explosives and hauling it with trucks. While Japanese units waited for proper materials to arrive from supply depots, Seabees improvised with whatever they could find. The Seabees weren't better builders. They were faster builders. And in the Pacific War, faster meant winning. Every day, an airfield was operational. Earlier meant another day of air superiority, another day of bombing enemy positions, another day the enemy couldn't resupply or reinforce. Speed compressed time itself into a weapon. By 1945, the Seabees had built 411 bases across the Pacific, airfields, ports, roads, hospitals, fuel storage, everything required to project American power across 6,000 miles of ocean. They built on volcanic rock, on coral atolls, on jungle islands. They built under fire, underwater, under conditions that would have stopped any peacetime construction project cold. The Japanese never matched that pace. They couldn't. Their construction doctrine, their equipment, their entire approach to military engineering belonged to an earlier era. The Seabees belong to the future. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On Espiritu Santo, the runway the Seabees built in 20 days remained operational for the rest of the war. It was expanded, improved, paved with concrete. But the coral base they laid in July 1942 stayed underneath, supporting thousands of aircraft, millions of tons of bombs, countless missions that pushed the Japanese back island by island until surrender came in August 1945. Lieutenant Commander Mattis later wrote that those 20 days taught him something about American ingenuity. Not that Americans were smarter or stronger, but that when Americans decided something had to be done, they found a way to do it regardless of obstacles. That stubborn refusal to accept limitations became the Seabees' greatest strength. The men who built that first runway scattered after the war, back to construction jobs in civilian life, back to families they hadn't seen in years. Most never talked much about Espiritu Santo. It was just one job among many. 20 days in the jungle. Nothing special. But those 20 days changed the Pacific War, proved that speed could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, demonstrated that skilled workers with the right equipment and the freedom to innovate could accomplish what traditional military engineering said was impossible. The Japanese spent 6 months building airfields the Seabees built in 20 days. That difference, multiplied across dozens of islands and hundreds of construction projects, was the difference between advance and stalemate, between momentum and collapse, between winning the war in 1945 instead of 1947. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.